I know you're hearing me, but that just to make sure the engineer gets everything right. Because everyone who don't know me, my name is Cleve Scott. I'm lecturer in history in the Department of History and Philosophy at this campus. And it is my responsibility to steer the ship tonight like Captain Hugh Mulzac, the first black man to get a merchant marine license. And he is from the same country that I'm from, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We wish to recognize the presence here tonight of Mr. Romain Lovell, the marketing manager of the Nation Publishing Company, and the chief executive officer of the Nation Publishing Company, Mr. Noel Wood. We also wish to recognize the presence of Dr. John Mulligan from Rice University in Texas, who is associated with the Slave Voyages project and is here in Barbados as part of the ROAD project, which is digitizing documents. I would like to invite you to stand for a minute of silence as we remember our fallen colleague, former principal, and former member and head of the Department of History and Philosophy, Sir Keith Hunt. Could you please stand for a moment? Thank you very much. It would be remiss of me also if I don't indicate that we recently lost another colleague in history from Rice University, Dr. Mulligan, a very good friend of mine, Professor Edward Cox, who was from Grenada, and also a graduate of this university campus. We will remember Professor Cox. I also now recognize in front of me a good colleague and friend of the university, Mr. Bulbulia. I didn't see you. We welcome you. And we welcome all the members of the Department of History and Philosophy, past and present. All of the students, undergrad and postgrad. I didn't promise anybody marks, so they're here on their own volition. I don't know if Dr. Innes or Dr. Carter, our head of department, Dr. Worrell, did it. But I wish to invite Dr. Worrell to the podium to bring warm remarks. Welcome, Dr. Worrell, please, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Mr. Noel Wood, CEO, Romain Lovell, Marketing Manager, Dr. John Mulligan of the Road Project and slavevoyages.org, Professor Cobley, I can't forget you, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dignitaries, students, welcome. The Department of History and Philosophy, the Nation newspaper, continues to canonize Elsa Guevara, who was an outstanding individual, the first female professor in history and the first female professor at the University of the West Indies. So this is a lady worthy of canonizing. This is the 38th anniversary or the 38th lecture in honor of Elsa Guevara, which in itself is a manifestation of how the university feels about the contribution of Elsa Guevara. And I want to thank the Nation Publishing Company for the long-standing partnership in partnering with the Department of History and Philosophy in keeping the program, keeping the lecture going. In another space, I would say, long live this partnership between the Nation newspaper and the Department of History, and we hope that it will continue to bear fruit in the future. Now, Professor Gavaya was a Guyanese who taught at the University of the West Indies in Mona, and she was one of the pioneer scholars in terms of a West Indian historiography. Back in her day, she was in the vanguard of having West Indian history taught in the schools. And she, along with some of her colleagues, produced some relevant information by books, pamphlets, etc., so that the teachers would have information available and they wouldn't have the excuse that there was no information available. A few generations later, historians today are fighting a different battle. The battle might be in many ways similar, because whilst the fight back then, on the eve of the nationalism of the independence period, today, in this neoliberal moment, we recognize that very little history is taught, and we are fighting to have history taught in the schools, not only West Indian history, but history, the discipline of history. And this is in a serious moment as well, because this is a moment of racial reckoning. This is a moment of apartheid justice, and therefore, it is a call, it is a challenge to have history taught inside the schools. I hold in my hand a book of 14 lectures, and this book is called Gavaya Essays in Honor of a Pioneer in West Indian Historiography. And this book will be launched on the 21st of October. And now I come to the lady of the moment. Dr. Rita Pemberton was a student of Elsa Gavaya. So I think that there is no fitting person to bring this lecture than Dr. Rita Pemberton. And in the activist tradition and the tradition of being a public intellectual, Dr. Pemberton is going beyond the narrow confines of the classroom, and she's here in this big tent to bring a topic that is extremely relevant to this particular moment, a moment where we are grappling with issues of slavery, still talking about colonialism, and we're talking about apartheid justice. So ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a warm welcome, and I hope that, and I have known Rita for maybe 2 decades, having met her at the Henry Sylvester Williams conference some years ago. So warm welcome to each and every one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Head of the Department of History and Philosophy here at Kayville, Dr. Wadney Worrell, who specializes in Black radicalism. He is a Pan-Africanist, has written extensively about the UNIA. So, Dr. Worrell, we thank you very much for your greetings. This lecture series is one of 2 ways in which we remember Professor Gavaya. We also have an annual scholarship called the Elsa Gavaya Scholarship, and many distinguished women on this campus have worn that hat. I don't know if it's intentional, but several women have won that scholarship. We are indeed fortunate or privileged to have formed a very good relationship with the wider family of the Nation Publishing Company. If you listen to your radio every day, you would hear something called Today in Bajan History. And we have gone further, and we have great moments in West Indies cricket. We thank Dr. Carter for crafting that, and we thank all of the members of staff of the History Department and the students and the wider community who are making this work. And Dr. Carter has told me that we are moving into the other islands very soon. So we thank the nation for giving us that head start. Also, it seems to me that Dr. Carter probably have convinced the nation to put their newspapers online, all the archives, I don't know. I will give him the credit. If the credit is not due to him, then when the next speaker comes to the fore from the Nation Publishing Company, we want to invite Romain, I nearly said Virgo, Romain Lovell, the marketing manager of the Nation Publishing Company. Welcome, Romain.
Thank you. I have no problem at all giving Dr. Carter the credit for helping us with the introduction of our archives. He was indeed an instrumental piece. Good night to everyone. As mentioned, I am Romain Lovell. I proudly head the Marketing and Communications Department of the Nation Group of Companies, and on behalf of the Nation Group of Companies, and Nation Publishing particularly tonight, I'm happy to be here with you to honor the memory of the late Professor Elsa Gavaya, a brilliant historian, riveting lecturer, and trailblazer. We've supported the Elsa Gavaya Memorial Lecture for over what I understand to be 30 years now, a legacy we are proud to continue. Every day at the Nation, we contribute to history by capturing it in words, photos, videos, and as mentioned before, they're all available in our online digital archives today. We, like Professor Gavaya, know the importance of telling our stories and reclaiming our narratives. In her seminal work, A Study of the Historiography of the British West Indies to the End of the 19th Century, she noted, the object of this book is to discuss the work of historians of the British West Indies and to try to evaluate the work that they have written. Professor Gavaya's past work documents the reality that has shaped our present lives, whilst providing much needed context for our future success. Her passion for her work was evident to all who heard her speak. Her lectures at the UWI Mona campus were always packed, both with history students and others from across disciplines. She was a proud West Indian, and by reevaluating and reframing history, she made others proud to be West Indian also. That pride explains why for over or close to 4 decades later, actually over 4 decades later, we still hold her memory dear through events such as this lecture. Tonight, her legacy lives on in this evening's orator, distinguished lecturer, as was mentioned, Dr. Rita Pemberton, a renowned historian whose work has significantly illuminated the complex tapestry of our island's past. Her lecture, entitled Trade, Trekking, and Trauma, The Journey Before the Middle Passage, I'm sure will offer invaluable insights into a critical period in our history. The journey from Africa to the Americas was undoubtedly beyond traumatic, and the experiences that preceded it, the trade networks, the forced marches, and the trauma inflicted upon the enslaved people are also significant in shaping our understanding of the transatlantic slave trade. I'm sure this lecture will afford us a comprehensive understanding of the strength and resilience of our ancestors, who wrote their names on history's page while enduring unimaginable cruelty. As we continue to grapple with the legacy of slavery and colonialism, it is imperative that we engage in thoughtful and critical examinations of our history and work with renowned historians like Dr. Pemberton and, of course, our very own Dr. Carter, as they offer a valuable contribution to this ongoing dialogue. On behalf of the Nation Publishing, I wish to express sincere gratitude to the University of the West Indies for again extending the warm invitation for us to partner with you to present yet another intriguing memorial lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you, Romy. And I see you know a thing about Mike. That means you probably sing and perform. Right, thank you very much. I wish to acknowledge your presence as well as Dr. Yannick Hume from the Department of Cultural Studies. We, in the Department of History and Philosophy at K-ville, we have enjoyed very good relationship with Cultural Studies before it's a department, and now it's a department, and now there is a Faculty of Culture. We have even deepened this association. The featured speaker, Dr. Pemberton, I remember seeing her in 1993 when we had the Association of Caribbean Historians there, and for some reason her image stuck in my memory. And a few days later, I was walking through Kingston next to where I live, and I saw this lady, and I wondered what she was doing here. And presumptuous me stopped and asked her, "What you doing here?" And she said to me, "I'm walking on the Botanic Gardens." I said, "Oh, at least someone else is interested in the history of St. Vincent and the Grenadines." But I think that she has had tremendous impact too on Tobago, where she's from, over the last few years in the Department of History and Philosophy. Including this year, we have postgraduate students from Tobago. And they haven't gone to St. Augustine. I don't know why. I don't know if Dr. Pemberton told them something about K-ville. But for some reason, we have had students continuously. To tell you more about Dr. Pemberton, we're going to invite Dr. Marcia Burrows, who is an academic, an actor, and I want to say something else, but she might punish me. Just give her a warm welcome to introduce the speaker, a very good friend of Dr. Pemberton, a very good friend of the Department of History, and a leading academic in the Department of Cultural Studies.
Well, I'm gobsmacked. Oh. Need to talk to you about that, Cleve. All right, greetings. Nowadays, you have to have glasses to see what you're reading. History, Africa, the Trek, slavery, emancipation, public health, national monuments, Tobago. These are but a few topics that our speaker has engaged in over many years of research. But I move, and so has Dr. Scott, that the study of Tobago is the dearest to our heart. Dr. Rita Pemberton retired as senior lecturer in history at the St. Augustine campus, University of the West Indies, where she had also been head of department. She also served as vice president, then president of the Association of Caribbean Historians, the ACH, as well as chief of CSEC Caribbean History with the Caribbean Examinations Council. She now serves as chair of the cabinet-appointed committee in Trinidad and Tobago, which has been mandated to review the placement of statutes, monuments, and signage. And she reminds us that really the 3 ships that have been given trouble in Trinidad, that's not part of her purview. The 3 ships that perhaps will be exchanged into a steel pan. Dr. Pemberton has won many awards. For example, she was awarded a Rockefeller Foundation Research Grant, as well as the Wellcome Trust Travel Grant that led to an attachment to the Wellcome Trust Center for the History of Medicine at the University College London. There she conducted research on the history of health in the Caribbean. In 2013, she was given a Queen's Jubilee Research Scholar Award. And in 2017, she was given the Living Legends Award by the Tobago House of Assembly. And this year, in 2024, the Ministry of Youth Development and National Service of Trinidad and Tobago gave her an award for her contribution to national development. Dr. Pemberton has attended many conferences and given many conference papers. She's also served as internal examiner and external examiner for PhDs in both history and in cultural studies. She has published several articles and co-edited many books, including with Dr. Heather Cato, that's entitled Beyond Tradition, Reinterpreting the Caribbean Historical Experience, published by Ian Randall Press. And yes, she is currently completing another collection of essays, co-edited again with Dr. Cato, that is due to be released next year, June 2025. And the list goes on and on and on. But I want to give a special focus to her work on Tobago. Dr. Pemberton was born in Tobago. Sidebar. If you really want to upset a Tobagonian, go ahead and presume that they were born in Trinidad. They are quick to remind you that the name of the country is Trinidad and Tobago. Dr. Pemberton has not lost sight of her roots. She has given public lectures on the history of Tobago. There was one called Seeing It as a Story of Contest. And she once gave a lecture for the Eric Williams Memorial Committee entitled, quote, "Did Eric Williams discriminate against Tobagonians?" She serves on the Tobago Writers Guild and is currently working on a book that engages the histories of Tobago. And she also writes a weekly column every week in a Tobagonian newspaper. I am told that to date, she has written 446 articles, one a week, over the past 8+ years. However, for tonight's discussion, Dr. Pemberton will take us along a most difficult journey, one in which we will benefit from her skills as a historian of note. Selecting the first leg of the slave trade as her focus, she will ask us to join her in the query of the culture and lived experience of the Africans. They're not yet enslaved. They were captured for the trade. These Africans were then made to go on a trek, sometimes over great distances, sometimes a week, 2 weeks, months, very many months, on their way to the coast, where they will be sold or bartered. Remember, they're not yet enslaved. The images we will see are grueling, and the accompanying narrative even more so. Entitled Trade, Trekking, and Trauma, The Journey Before the Middle Passage, let us welcome our speaker, Dr. Rika Pemberton, as she delivers the 38th Elsa Gavaya Memorial Lecture.
Good evening, everyone. Let me thank Dr. Burrows for her very kind introduction. I will speak to her after. I want to say yes, I was taught by Professor Gavaya, but I wanted to make it absolutely clear. I thought Professor Gavaya's as a historian, the way she taught, the way she wrote, was way up there. So I might be reaching, but I am not there. I will do my best to demonstrate some of the things that I have learned in her class. Now, one of the things that has struck me over time was the Middle Passage, the whole obsession with the Middle Passage, to the point where I did a little survey and I asked some students what they thought about Caribbean history, and everybody's remarks were about the Middle Passage. So I said, are you aware that there was something else about the history of the slave trade before the Middle Passage, other than the Middle Passage? But that is not in many people's consciousness. There's this Middle Passage, and there's some real good research going on right now, and the volumes of information about how many boats and where they went, and figures trying to establish the death rate aboard the ship, but certainly strong consciousness about conditions aboard the ship as they left the coast of Africa across the Caribbean. So I asked some people, what happened at the coast where, you know, the ships left the coast, but where did the people belong to? And there was not that understanding. They were kidnapped and put on the boats. So that is the extent of the knowledge, and I don't think that would promote a proper understanding of the extensiveness of the trade and the impact on those people who were captive and brought across to the Americas. So I began by looking at some of the earlier writers, and I got this quote from Patrick Manning, not the Trinidad Prime Minister, by the way. In his book, he says, while the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, through which millions of slaves suffered in bondage, cramped and humiliated, remains the central image of the slave trade in general, the full scope and image of even the interregional slave trade went far beyond this image and the reality of this voyage. So I set out, and this is after I had written my contribution to the book that was published for Professor Beckles. I thought, you know, we have been missing out on a lot. So I'm directing attention to the processes through which the cargo on the ship, because remember, they weren't people, they were items, were obtained, and highlights the experiences of the captive Africans during their journey across the continent to the seacoast, where they were boarded for their destinations across the Atlantic. So I look at their means of transportation, highlighting rivers, waterways, canals, and this is to show how what was a trading arrangement, a trade route for goods and essential for people inside Africa, how that was converted to a business selling people. So in the abstract, I note the focus on the Middle Passage, which I agree is very attractive to researchers, but because of the ease or the relative ease of getting information, but it was neither the start nor the most important arm of the trade. And I try in this presentation to give visibility to the role and significance of the inland trade in the trade business, slave trade business. So what I want to show is how extremely traumatic this phase of the slave trade was and its consequences. That is, before they enter the ship and deal with whatever was there, its consequences for their mental state. So I look at the role of the slave coffle, which many students are familiar with, and we have a sort of stylized version in most of the books of the coffle. Oh, sorry, I'm not even doing what I'm supposed to do. Turn right. Nothing is happening. Oh, put it on. Well, the green light didn't come on. I'm busy talking. All right. All right. So where are we now? All right. Let's see what's happening. Okay, so I started with that. So the abstract, now we are there. No, all right, there. Right, so the objectives. What I'm trying to look at is the role of the couple, how the demand for the captives to service the industries in the Americas led to a shift in the supply sources. And so the trade routes became extended from the coast to the interior of Africa. So in this process, we look at the importance of rivers, waterways, canals, how the traditional trade was diverted to a human trade, the psychological impact on captives, and on their mental state, which was evident before the Atlantic journey. So one of the reasons why most people's perception and understanding has to do with the emphasis on the Middle Passage, which details poor conditions on ships, the increasing demand from plantations with the growth and expansions both in the Caribbean and America, and the sources of information that are available readily, ships logs, plantation records, narratives of participants. So we have studies on the number of European ships, ships of European origins, numbers boarded, resistance at sea, and profits from the slaving enterprise. So that material, good in itself, useful, does not give sufficient visibility to what happened before the ships. So what I like to do, what I like to do is to look at the literature and what the literature suggests us. So I looked at Caribbean discourses, and Glissant, he was writing in the French Caribbean, that is a site of a history characterized by ruptures that began with brutish dislocation, the slave trade, a dislocation which occurred in the context of shock, contraction, painful negotiation, and explosive sources. So I see that as linking to the trauma that was experienced by those people who were captured. And so he went on to say, to understand this history, is necessary to dig deep through a tormented chronology to find the subterranean convergence of our history. So my comment there, that is very relevant to the entire Caribbean. And then I looked at Walter Rodney, who, in How Europe and Underdeveloped Africa, stated, the numbers killed in the slave trade were not restricted to mortality in transshipment. Numerous deaths occurred in Africa between the time of capture and the time of embarkation, especially in cases where captives had to travel hundreds of miles to the coast. And in addition, the numbers killed and injured in warfare from which captives were obtained need to be considered. So we need to look deep and far to find the true roots of the slave trade that we are so familiar with. Now, one of the features of the slave trade that maybe is also not so visible is that it provided another theater of a war for European rivalry. So they will express their differences and annoyances with each other by fighting for control of the trade. So if France was known to have located a village that had not yet been touched the British would make sure and present themselves there. So the competition continued. So they were fighting in the Caribbean, they were fighting in Americas, they were fighting in Europe, they were also fighting in Africa. They built forts to protect their trade, but in the process of protecting their own trade, they attacked other people's forts. So some of the most famous forts, well, I list them: Elmina, Axum, Cape Coast, Accra, and Cape Coast was shared between the British and the, well, not shared, taken over and belonged once to the British and once to the Dutch. So, as Glissant advised, digging deep. We are digging deep because the conflict was not restricted to the coastal areas. European rivalry for captives to feed the slave trade results in the creation of a landscape of terror which extended far into the interior of Africa. So this is the internal journey that preceded the Middle Passage. Now, I suggest that this internal phase of the trade was critical for obtaining the cargo for the slave ships, but it is not yet center stage in Caribbean historiography. I have to state, though, that Alvin Thompson's 2 books depart a bit from that because he has provided more information, a little bit more information in his thing than we would find in the average text. I start with Robin Law, who began his work by asserting that Europeans showed little interest in penetrating the interior. That is understandable for a short period of time. It was because of the fear of death, fear of the unknown, fear of disease, because, you know, like most of the tropical countries, the interior of Africa definitely became associated with the wise man's grave, so they weren't going there. But further on in his book, he concedes that violence was the principal means of obtaining captives, and captives were brought from the interior in canoes, and he says sometimes from far inland. So to me, now we've already experienced a reference to the trauma. We have already read about the interest in going far in the interior, and from Comrade Rodney, violence was the principal means. So we have a link already established with the interior, because that link established the conduct of trade to the interior, trade being goods that were required by the population for their survival. But the European rivalry entirely changed the nature of this trade. And the fact is, Europeans made friends with particular rulers. You made friends, and the Portuguese started it by selling them weapons. So those weapons empowered the leaders so they could have the chance to extend their control over neighboring communities. So you have that presence causing further conflict in the communities on the inland areas of Africa. So kidnapping and warfare became central means. Wars and raids became part of the daily life of the hinterland in West Central Africa, in the forested area, where factories were set up by English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish and American firms. So this inland trade, the Portuguese had their handlers, and they were called pombieros, but they were like agents. And other traders brought and sold them stuff, and the selling occurred at marketplaces called feiras, so we have the basis for the fairs. So we have to get these captives. So the coastal areas couldn't provide. So if you think of it, a ship comes, somebody grabs somebody, sets fire to a little community on the coast. Most people don't even live there, but even those areas that were heavily inhabited along the coast, if after once, twice, 3 times this happened, what would you do? You would relocate yourself or establish some means of defending yourself. But the coast did not provide enough persons to put on board those ships. So with a reduction in the numbers available in the coastal areas, recourse was made to inland. And the fears were established to sell these trades. So you get the captives and you really don't have the ship that is going. You sell it to somebody who represents the country or one of the countries that was interested in the trade. So numbers of factories were established along the rivers, along the coast, and particularly at the mouths of rivers, because the inland supply was coming down through there. Now, we have to, you don't do a history of the Caribbean without Barbadian planters. They complained about the increased prices that they were being made to pay for captives, and they produced a pamphlet called Groans from the Plantations. But in the Caribbean history, the planters always groaning about something. So this time is the price too high, so they want them cheaper. Not to mention they still wanted to make much profit. So the price increase, and the increased prices had to do with numbers available. So sometimes the price was a little lower than others, and other times the price was higher. In the heat of the competition, prices increased. So we have, what have I done? All right. So we have this map which shows the areas that were involved in slave trading. There was an area called the Slave Coast, which includes Benin, Nigeria, well, present-day Benin, Nigeria, and Togo, and then the Gold Coast, which was heavily circled around Ghana. So we have access to a population because these territories have a coastline, but they penetrate inland as well. So I have a little, did you know section. Well, I have several in it. Captives were pawned. So we will read the books and they'll say, well, they were kidnapped and they were grabbed and they were sold by their chiefs. But the pawning, I mean, we in the Caribbean know about carrying things to the pawn shop. So you pawn your persons because you don't have the money or the items to pay for them. So they will give you a little time, and if you don't redeem them in time or in time before the ship that they're working with sails, then they're gone. They were valued. The value of the enslaved people was not quoted in the money that was paid for them in the Americas. So they use sticks, they use pieces, they use pawns, so they have the bars trade, the pieces trade, the pawn trade, the copper trade, the ackee trade, but they measure them often by pieces of sticks, so you count them out and tell the person, well, this is the amount of money, this is the amount you will get for your cargo. So the trade stretched from West Central Africa to Madagascar and Southeast Africa, and involved more than half of West Central Africa. So what we have then is a wide area of supply, certainly larger than what was there prior to this expansion. I want us now to look a little bit about impact. So these captives have been rounded up. They have been forcibly removed from their homes. They have been able to, or forced to look at and experience all kinds of trauma. So the mental health experts have directed us to several types: direct trauma, acute trauma, complex trauma, and secondary or vicarious trauma. So now we have an image here of the traumatized, how they might look. Direct trauma, the immediate impact of a traumatic event. So I would say, if we look at the fact that you are kidnapped, that by itself is trauma. If your house or your village is set on fire, that is trauma. If you are separated as a result from members of your family, it's trauma. So you have several sources of trauma just in capturing. And then you have acute, if it is a result of a single traumatic event. Well, I don't know how we will calculate a single. If you capture me, you separate me from my family, you burn the place I call home, all of that. But it's complex trauma, a series of traumatic events which have a lasting effect. But I would think that if you're kidnapped or if your village is burned, all those would have a lasting effect on you. I was particularly interested in vicarious trauma, which is when you witness an event which impacts your emotional health, and this is used to assess the mental state of the captives. So you witness a traumatic event. We will see a lot of that happening in the coffle. And what the experts say, the total, like the mathematicians, if you add direct, acute, complex, and vicarious, you get emotional trauma, which is something you have to live with unless you have expert intervention. So I mentioned earlier about the fairs that were set up by the Portuguese. Now these became much more expansive and fully developed at the heights of the rivalry of the Europeans. But part of the fairs, now the fairs was the sort of low-level market. Later on you have larger, more established markets. But you have to have an examination. And this examination is done by a person who represents one country or another. So your teeth, you have to, well, they open your mouth. I mean, you don't have to do anything. They do everything for you. So they examine your mouth, and your value is reduced if you have missing teeth or if any sign of anything wrong with your mouth. Then they examine your body parts, and they try to make sure, or just by their groping and feeling and pulling, that you don't have any disease with you. If you have any sign of skin lesions, all that reduces your value. It does not say that you'll be free. It reduces your value. So that was traumatic for people who never have had that exposure. And from the descriptions in the text, it was never a pleasant exercise. So this trade that moves inward became highly organized. Each country had factors and factories. The factors, agents, and companies. And then the coffle, that was the next step, markets and fairs, and then agency to transport them to the coast. So they passed through a number of handlers. So when you, at the fairs, you have one thing. When you at the river, you get another kind of experience. When you're in a couple. All right. So this trade, anyway, linked almost all of Africa, moving people in the trade. And the whole object was to find, obtain, and hold enough captives to fill their ships. The factors provided goods and service to all departments. So they will have material to repair canoes, nuts and bolts and chains to restrain the captives, everything that was required above, and then you have to get items for trade, factors and factories, that was their role. But they had to keep abreast of what was going on with their competitors. They had to establish good relations with the leaders of African communities. And they had to be like spies. They had to tell their bosses what was going on everywhere. So they encouraged further exploration to go further into the depths of Africa to find out how far rivers were navigable, what communities lived in the far reaches, what size of their populations. And of course, they laid down the rule for the conduct of trade on the rivers. Just another, do you know, that in the books, the item that is emphasized as essential for trade was guns. It had a lasting impact. It caused more wars and disruption of the communities. But salt, for the internal trade, salt was very important. And then, of course, the ships, you have to carry your captives out. You feed them. Now, this was not a feast. But there was a perception that the captives that were obtained from the particular areas had particular taste. It wasn't always correct. But those they thought came from the windward coast. And again, the people they caught were all mixed. But rice from the Gold Coast, they offered maize. From Lagos and those areas, maize and beads. From Benin, Bonny, Calabar, Cameroon's yams. But you know, yams constituted a basic item of food for the African. So we go back to Walter Rodney. When you do anything in Africa, you can't avoid reading Rodney. He said very often a captive was sold and resold as he made his way from the port of embarkation. And this is what happened at the fairs. You are taken to a fair, you are sold to somebody else. At that same fair, another person might come and offer a better price for this item that has been captured, and so is sold. However, on the whole, the process by which captives were obtained on African soil was not trade at all. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. And Walter Rodney describes it as social violence. So you have an explosion of exports because the inland has taken you into an area where it was not exploited before. So the further in you went, the more you got. So there was a sudden surge of slave exports from Lower Guinea, Gold Coast, Slave Coast, where the clearest explosion occurred. Right. So now, the next step, when they are captured inland, they have to be brought out. Wars, looting, smuggling, and the other thing about the Europeans, slave stealing was another means. So they stole from each other wherever the defenses were not sufficiently strong. So this coffle is made up of people who are chained together at their feet, bolted at their necks, and walked in single file. The operators of the trade were very security conscious. They made extra efforts to institute precautions to prevent the escape or revolt. So they liked the fairs because what the fairs did was to offer an opportunity to move the captives from close to the areas from which they came. So the thought process was that the closer they were to home, the greater likelihood there was of being lost to their captors because they would try to run away, or their kith and kin might try to remove them. So it was hoped that frequent movement from one trader to another would extinguish this hope and make them happy to stay captive. I found one example of a revolt. Now, the way the captives were tied up, which you will see in another image, it was difficult to revolt. But on the island of St. Louis in Senegal, one such revolt occurred. And what happened there is that they were waiting for a long time to be taken from the interior to the coast. And in the process, there was a sort of relaxation of some of the safety measures. So the prisoners were able to acquire axes and knives and tools to cut their chains. And they planned this revolt. And the day of the revolt, they remained sad and praying. But at nightfall, they set huts ablaze, murdered officials, and some escaped to the river. They were caught by the troops, and although they were begging and pleading, some were massacred by the soldiers. Now, what was interesting about the description from a Frenchman, and the Frenchman has some dealings in the Caribbean, Villeneuve. They said many lives were lost, but the chains were, the slaves in the holding bay. They're in the holding bay, which is in about like a dungeon underneath. They were chained in twos, and they could not break the chains. So, in the quest for freedom, one killed another. So the place was littered with a multitude of dead bodies, and some were found with their feet and hands cut off. So you're trying to get free, and this man is keeping you back. You have a knife in your hand, so you relieve him of the arms and on the chains and at feet, so you could run. The stronger killed the weaker, and so the company lost 90 captives, 18 escaped, and 72 were killed. So if I could just flash back to that. So back to the trauma, the vicarious, when you saw something happen. So if you can imagine yourself looking at a person who in his quest for freedom has cut off any part of the body of another one. So I would see that as another traumatic experience of those who lived to tell the tale. Other experiences. The couple traveled through forests. I think we had a picture, no, not here. A picture of a couple. The images we have them changed, or you can see the change, but you can't see the environment. And that context is very important. So you are walking through forests, your arms are bound, your feet are bound. So if you have a scratch, you can't attend to it. Your natural inclination is to respond by scratching. You can't do that. So you're receiving insect bites and stings as you go through. You are crawling through streams filled with leeches and snakes. Remember, this is in single file. You have to go, so everybody has to go through that. And so some develop infected ulcers on their bare feet. And if they didn't move fast enough, they were beaten. The whips were made of hippopotamus hide. So you have to keep the pace. But the trek, the line of people going are distressed. So the children are crying, and the distressed adults are singing mournful song, and that, these are the symbols of the fears that this very distressed group of captives was about to enter the grounds. Children were considered nuisances. So if they're crying and bawling, then the leader will happily throw them in the wild and leave them for the animals. Any child born on the creek, now, the thing is, when they captured a village, if they captured a pregnant woman, she's going on the trek. And if they had any birds, they will be discarded, the jackals would be happy. Some people picked up diseases, dysentery, malaria, and some people died in the process. Again, if you are in the coffle and you have to look at a dead person, sometimes they were taken they were dragged so far before they were removed. So dying members of the couple remained chained to the living. There was a case where the couple was attacked by a swarm of bees. No, I think I missed that one. By a swarm of bees, and one woman who was badly injured, they just cut her chains, set her free, and left her abandoned in the bushes. And even when the captives nearly died of hunger or thirst, the couple kept going, because the business was to get the people to a point, living or dead. So one author described the situation: dead bodies is Palmer. Dead bodies marked the route to the coast. It was a prey for scavengers. Many died on the coast before even setting foot on a ship. So there we have on this one, the trek, how they are tied, but we don't have enough of the environment to demonstrate the kinds of problems they experience. So they passed ruins of burnt-out village. That was a symbol that the catchers had already passed there. They had to cross rivers which swarmed with crocodiles, and some provided fodder for the crocodiles. They crossed wildernesses in a huddle to protect themselves against lions. They traversed wild and rocky country, rising hills with monkeys and other wild beasts. The great slave couples sometimes comprised hundreds of sufferers stretched for miles en route for months. And that is also the problem, the length of time the couple took to move from one point to another. So we then have another, did you know? In spite of the abolition in 1808, the trade was still going on, involving even the person who had, the country which had imposed the ban in the first place. We wanted to make reference to the fact that in some communities in inland, when the community ran out of food, or when in families they were willing to sell people, or some people sold themselves as a source of food. And one author noted that famine was a lucrative period for the trade because parents then sold their children, making it easier to fill boats. And then we have this interesting panniering of natives, which you credit the goods from an agent. So he comes and he brings what you want, sword, guns, whatever else. You don't have money to pay for it, so you credit the goods and they leave a pawn on the ship. And they usually would leave children, members of their family. And if the ship or the canoe that's coming for the cargo comes and the pawn has not been released by the payment required, they go with the children. When the couple has arrived at the market, there are lots of descriptions about their condition, emaciated condition. One writer described the couple as a long caterpillar on the move for weeks from villages far inland. Many had already had different owners. Now, every owner who purchased a captive had to examine. So this captive would have been examined by several people in the fairs, and now in the big market, be again examined. So you have, they're deploring, they're scarred, they're bleeding, and I did not see, or I have not yet seen, any reference to the women who were in the couple and what happened when they were menstruating. No mention. Anyway, one participant described, I have seen some of these poor, wretched people so terrified with apprehensions of their expected face as to remain in a state of lethargy. Their attenuated bodies prove their journey has been long, tedious, and exhausting. So observers are making comments that suggest that they are aware that these people experience trauma, and if they remain in a state of lethargy, it is more than just trauma. Something else was mentally going on. On the Did You Know, I make reference to another silent group in the literature, the reject. What happened to the reject slaves? You go to the market, and then in the end, when you have a bundle, they will throw in the bundle somebody who doesn't have the value that the planter, the person, the agent wanted. Well, their fate was sealed. Beaten, put to death, beheaded, used for sacrifices, or thrown overboard into the river. And so, depending on where in the river this occurred, there will be food for the alligators. If it's lower down, close to an estuary, it will be sharks and alligators. So now we look at the rivers. The rivers were very important in this process because, remember, the big ships can't come upriver, so you have to take them out, and the canoes, therefore, played an important role as well. So one writer, Ben O'Cree, he says, in the beginning there was a river. The river became a road, and the road branched out to the whole road. In other words, the road was supplying people all over. And because the word was a river, it was always hungry. So they was always looking out for people. And again, as I said earlier, rivers were central to the internal domestic trade, and they were critical to the intensification of the human trade. They facilitated intelligence gathering, which what the Europeans were hungry for, and then that permitted the establishment of factories all the way up. The factors used the rivers then as a base to establish friendly relations with the leaders of communities and secure trading arrangements with them to edge out their competitors. But then the rivers, on which communities had depended so much, became dangerous because of slave stealing and kidnapping. Right, so the next one just shows us a map. No. Well, I don't know why I get in these multiple screens. I just want the one at the bottom. I'm not tech savvy. I just want to show the rivers and the areas that they drained to indicate the extent. Let me see if this, that goes to, all right. Oh. Yeah. Right. Right, so this shows the different rivers, the drainage, the areas that they service, and how penetration was made possible right into the heart of Africa. Now, what happened on the rivers? All these canoes were very busy shipping out captives. So they teamed with activity, and the captives were crammed into the canoes and highly guarded. They packed the males first, they put them at the bottom with their hands tied behind their backs, and then all the rest layered on top of them until the canoe was full. Then it will make off with its cargo. And they built them different sizes, 70 feet long, so they could manage 80 captives. And they had to paddle. You have to keep the boat, the canoes balanced, or else everybody would provide meat for sharks or alligators. But what happened with the canoes now? Small ships were outfitted. And in one case, the author talked about the Liverpool trade, where small persons, we know of the wealthy people owning plantations and wanting enslaved to work them. But we have these small people, ropers, drapers, tallow handlers, barbers, from Liverpool, who come together and they set up little shipping businesses. So they bring out their own supply. So we have all these people who were stimulated by the chance to get rich quickly, make quick fortunes. They set up these boats to bring out more people so they get more money. But on board the canoes, the captives were exposed to the elements. They were underfed. So you had a death rate, and the style was like on sea. If you die in the canoe, they throw you overboard. But the rivers became like highways that served to become the extension of the Atlantic Ocean. So the connection was strong. So what I conclude in the end, that the internal trade constituted a critical part of the trade in captive actors. Captives were exposed to traumatic situations in every phase of the trade. And this has important consequences both for the sending and receiving communities of the Africans. This aspect of the history must be fully understood if we are to understand fully what the trade in captive Africans was. Too many important features about the occurrences during the capture remain unknown, and this is an area that merits more serious research. The process of procurement has implications. Hold on. No. Oh. Well, I don't know why we have this multiple screen and it's not showing the one we want. Well, all right. The process of procurement had implications for the mental health of the captives who arrived at the coast of Africa traumatized and mentally compromised. The multi-layered trauma of constant forced disruption, brutality, the coffle and its savagery, the inhuman conditions of life under which they live, made them prone to post-traumatic stress disorders, which were to be further compounded by the transatlantic journey. The explosion of captive exports brought parasitic leeches that had stuck themselves to the skin of Africa, ruthlessly sucking its blood and draining its vitality. And that's a quote from one author. And my view is that this tormented chronology shows the Otikai at work, spreading mental contagion into the colonies. According to Glisson, it's necessary to adopt a prophetic vision of the past, remove the dead tissue of colonial rule, and repossess our historical space. This is a call then for the young historians to move strongly into this area of research. Thank you for your attention. Thanks.
Another round of applause for Dr. Pemberton. I would say to you that she's on the cutting edge, and her presentation have invited scholars to move into a new era of focus. All of us who have read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, who are familiar with the work of Professor Alvin Thompson, we know that historians have focused mainly on trade, stats, politics, economics. But believe it or not, my takeaway is the need to focus on the trauma, on the psychological damage. And it is fortuitous that the Department of History and Philosophy has brought Dr. Pemberton at a time when we are looking at men's mental health. I think the department needs another round of applause for that. So we will open the floor for questions. How are we doing it, technician? We have a mic rolling.
One mic there. There's a mic right there.
The mic is on the left, my left. One mic.
One on the right.
And one on the right. And one on the right. Thank you very much. So in the good tradition, you line up behind the microphone, and then I will acknowledge you. So I would start with a friend who I met tonight. I can't remember the name, as the song says, but I remember the face. You could begin by telling us who you are, and go ahead with your question.
I'm Fatima Dupre-Griffiths, and I'm coming from a cultural studies angle, but I had a bit of a chat with Dr. Pemberton. And I want to say thank you, Dr. Pemberton, before I even ask my question, for shifting the focus from merely focusing on the Middle Passage to the trauma, the trekking and the trauma prior to the Middle Passage. Thank you for that. Thank you. And my question is actually, I'm preempting my PhD research question. I'm looking at the ancestor syndrome, and one that you've mentioned, I'm calling post-traumatic slave syndrome. And my question is, do you think returning to Africa and looking at African-centered expressive art therapy, which is my background, can assist in the healing, that healing journey of the trauma of those two syndromes? Do you think that's possible? Thank you.
I think that, are we?
Keep going, keep going.
Is
Say
this
something,
okay?
say something again. Say something.
I think that going back to Africa is an enlightening and empowering experience. We do not, on this side, fully understand many things about Africa, and you learn a lot by going there. Now, whether or not that could constitute the healing process, I can't say. I will have to leave the experts in psychiatry and psychology to answer that. But certainly, if the strategies used are different to those that currently exist from the West, I think you have a market there.
Thank you very much. Eddie Grant said, hello, hello, Africa. You send me away with a broken heart. Who's next? Well, we're live on UWITV, and we don't want the audience to think that the broadcast has ended. So I'll go with the lady on the left and then the gentleman on the right. Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Yes, good evening.
Margaret, I didn't recognize you. The light is my face.
I
Thank
know
you very
you
much,
are.
Margaret.
The light is right.
Yes, Dr. Pemberton. My name is Margaret Gill. I ended up in humanities. And I recognize that you quoted Ben O'Cree, a poet, in one of the slides that you had. You quoted him talking about the road becomes a river and the river, etc. It goes to the whole world. And I wondered to what extent have you used other kinds of literary sources, like, for example, Kamau Brathwaite, the poet, historian Kamau Brathwaite, has done work that attempts to trace that route from the interior. So have you considered that, or have you used that work?
Yes, I always go to the literature for anything I'm doing. There's no facet of Caribbean history that can be properly done without reference to the literary thinkers. Yes, Kamau Brathwaite is one I read all the time.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Just for the purpose of those who are listening at home, in history, we use literature, the creative arts, as a form of reference, whether it's George Lammons in The Castle of My Skin and so on. Yes, go ahead with your question, sir.
Hi, good evening. I'm Cesar Benedetti from the Venezuelan Embassy. Thank you very much for the invitation to Dr. Worrell. It was great to hear you on your lecture. I'm kind of curious about, I think it relates to the question that the lady said, but I'm curious about the sources to go to for that period before the Middle Passage. There's any registry? What is the point of view of that sources? Is from the point of view of the kidnappers, or there's any registry from the kingdoms, from the communities that were there at the time? That kind of resumes my question. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure that I...
He wants to know, like, the hidden voices, about pull the voice out. How you pull the voice out?
All right. I found it useful to look at the older historical works because they are very revealing. And then you could have the participants themselves, and that from that you can identify some hidden voices, some persons who were perhaps victims who escaped, or relatives of victims who could tell their stories. So you want in the history to reflect the whole gamut of experiences. You want people to tell you what they felt other than what other people wrote about what they felt. So as historians, that is our task. And it is, of course, a little more difficult for inland than for the coast. So as I said, it was easier for people to conduct research on Caribbean history dealing with the Middle Passage, but the internal But that is absolutely important, so we have to persevere. If we don't look, we won't see.
Thank you very much.
Next.
Greetings, my beloved sister. Blessings to the house that attended this very important soul-searching and soul-answering conversation lecture. You mentioned Dr. Rodney and in paying tribute to his groundings with the people. I am also from Trinidad. I live right next to you, beloved.
Oh, you do?
And I am a child of the 1970s revolution in Trinidad. And I say this to put this in perspective, because having a consciousness of your pathway, I asked my wife, who visited Senegal, to bring a token. And she brought from Guri dungeons a parcel of earth. We had a young child in the house. And from the time the earth entered into the house, every night that baby wake up screaming, "Hello!" The horror of the slave dehumanization lived in the vibration. And a baby now coming out of the spiritual elements was able to pick up. I took the earth to my spiritual father, Archbishop Granville Williams, and he blessed it. You know, that child slept as a baby afterwards. And I am saying this to get to your point of healing. How do we use the knowledge that we are unearthing now to heal our people? Because recently I was reading Joy DeGuy, post-traumatic slavery disorders, poverty-induced stress disorders. How then with this crime? How then with this post-traumatic slavery disorders? How are our young people to find their pathway as to contributing individuals under a capitalist system, the same system that caused their trauma generations? How then do they find themselves under the same system that is brutalizing their sensibilities and their connections in order to become whole, contributing citizens of African ancestry? Ashe?
Thank you very much.
Well, we have to begin, like everything else, at the beginning. We have a system of education across the Caribbean that really does not allow you to understand who you are and how you came. And it is made worse by the media, which splashes images that makes many young and some older people think that they have to behave in certain ways to conform. And some deeper issues have not been addressed. So we have to begin, like Glissant said, begin and look deep into ourselves to understand who we are and what are the issues that we face as a consequence of the experience our ancestry has had. And that's how I would guide an action to deal with what we are dealing with in present-day Caribbean. That's it.
Thank you. I am Michael Rashid Taylor. I am, amongst other things, engaged in spiritual leadership and wellness approaches, living between two cities in Ontario, but my navel string buried in Brimshill. So, Dr. Pemberton, thank you very much for your words and your approach and what you've shared with us this evening. A different approach to understanding slavery, its impacts, and something that I really never really understood before in a deeper manner as you have presented tonight. And I agree that it calls for more research and it calls for digging, and especially for younger historians that are now starting their work and their academic life. So my question, I accept that you're a historian, you've said that, and not a therapist or one engaged in that particular aspect of healing, but to accept that history can be an aspect of healing, particularly our people. But what do you say, but we healers do say that the journey of unlearning learned behaviors starts to begin or has to begin with the discovery of the contributing factors of the trauma or the learned behaviors. From your perspective as a historian, where can people start that healing journey from a historian's perspective? And what can you offer as a beginning place for healers or people who seek to be healed? Thank you.
Well, I don't know that I can offer much in terms of what you do about the healing. As I said, that is for experts, that's not my expertise. But we can begin by conversations, by education. We have to. People don't understand who they are. People still hate themselves because they are black. People hate others because they are black. And we have to get beyond that. And if we understand what our origins are, where we came from, and if we can accept who we are, I think we will be on the road to healing.
What do you mean, that we don't eat certain things? All right. For the purpose of the gentleman who asked the question, there's a lot of literature on oral history as a methodology for responding to trauma. There's a lot of scholarship on it. Now, oral history. Yes, Mr. Wallace, a graduate of our department.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Dr.
Pemberton, thank you so much for your thought-provoking lecture. My name is Jeffrey Wallace, and I'm a history teacher at one of our secondary schools, Harrison College. And I just wanted to thank you very much because the information that you brought will be very useful to our department in giving the students more of an insight in what happened before the infamous Middle Passage. Just wanted to ask this question. Is it possible that the trauma that was experienced is still being experienced by the descendants today?
The trauma that exists today has to do with people perceiving you as inferior, people perceiving you as always a criminal on the shady side, people denying you opportunities, people follow you around in supermarkets expecting that you are there to steal. All that is traumatic and terrifying for people. I mean, it's not good to, and particularly in some countries, you have security guard following you around. So we have that kind of trauma. It is not of the ilk that was experienced on the ships in the interior, in the canoes, or even at sea across the Middle Passage, but in modern day, yes, we have modern day trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Pemberton, for a very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, I'm only an engineer. I don't have the history or the healing or anything like that. So my question is a bit more practical, I think. We are the victims. The people in this room are the victims. But back in Africa, I'm wondering, obviously there are those who traded, there are those who captured. So is there a similar trauma? Can you comment on that? And are our, back in Africa, are they looking at the trauma that was created in their societies? Because you have the people who kidnapped other people and captured them in war. Is that existing trauma in Africa, and is that something that they are looking at in their societies? Do you know?
Yes, there's considerable research in Africa on the captivity. I mean, you have this one pointing fingers at the other group and saying they were participants. It's something that needs to be carefully ironed out. Yes, they were part of the process, but it seems to me that a business was set up and you either participated or you were caught. So yes, it is something that needs discussion, but there is considerable research in Africa by African scholars in the diaspora as well, looking at some of those questions.
No more questions? Yes, Suleiman.
Thank you, Dr. Pemberton. And a follow-on question, well, 3 questions, but 2 as a follow-on. In your research, did you unlock those groups that were actively involved in capturing? Were they capturing in their own villages, or were they going to other communities to capture? That's one question. The second question is, did you come across any persons that was actively fighting against this capturing of people? So as you capture people, were there groups that were actually trying to free them from their captors? And the third question related to one of your slides when you quoted from, I think, a French in Senegal, the captives that were trying to escape. And you said that it mentioned that they prayed during the day. Did it describe how they pray?
No, I don't have a description of how they prayed. I just got the sense that they did not want to raise any suspicions, so they behaved in the ways that they would normally have done whilst downstairs in the barracoon. One. I forget the first question.
Where did they take them from?
Oh, where they the source of capture. Well, the tendency, I don't have any, or I have not encountered any reports from participants in Africa, but I did not get a sense that they were capturing their own people, that they usually looked for their enemies or the other groups than their own. And then there's a third question.
No, that's it.
Yes, yeah, one of the security measures was to guard against that. And as I mentioned, they thought that moving them from one place to the other to move away from the areas from which they came was part of a security mechanism, because they felt that they would either try to run away or their kith and kin would come and try to free them. So there were obviously those attempts, because they are recorded in the literature.
Good evening. My name is Cecily Spencer Cross, and I just want to ask the question. Sometimes when you say to someone that you're from Africa, and the response is, I'm African, Azerbaijan, and then they might proceed to tell you that the African people used to sell one another to the people. Wasn't that part of a trauma as well, where these people now who are having that idea that Africans used to bad treat Africans and sell the Africans, that they are indeed suffering from trauma as well?
I mean, they mean the people now?
Yes.
Africans used to sell Africans, yes, that's given.
Mhm.
They were part of a process. Now, I don't know that any African community would have been able to withstand the attack by the Europeans with their guns. And so what they did was to cause greater separation between and among the African communities. So you empower one with guns, so he really wants to expand his control, or he has, and people want to get away from him. So he's using his guns and his friendship with France or whoever to expand his influence. So that set one against the other. That is how it worked. That is the reality of his operation. But that doesn't say that us in Barbados should look at each other and tell us that Africans sold Africans. Your behavior now has to be influenced by what you know, what you think of yourself. So you don't need an excuse to say you don't want to do this or that because that happened. Your grandmother had a little house and you now have a better one, so you don't curse your grandmother because she had that. So what it is about is your sense of your being, your pride in yourself, and I think the most important thing for everyone, whatever your station in life, if you have a pride in yourself, you don't have to blame it on anybody else.
Right. Thank you.
Good. I don't see anyone else behind any other mic, but Cicely, while you take your seat, I'll tell you Peter Tosh answered that question and Beckett answered that question. Both said, never mind where you come from. Once you are a black man, and of course a woman, you are an African. And with that, I would like to invite a Calypsonian by trade and a professional historian in the making, our PhD candidate, Andre Lane, a.k.a. Apollo, to give the vote of thanks. Welcome, Apollo.
Thank you, Master of Ceremonies. Protocol having been established, on behalf of the Department of History and Philosophy, University of West Indies Cave Hill campus, I wish to extend sincere thanks to the following persons for their roles in the successful staging of the 30th, Elsa Gavaya Memorial Lecture. Our lecturer, Dr. Rita Pemberton, for her skillful navigation of what was the most painful excavation, but a necessary one. And as was said in the comments, this research will, I believe, spur further research into a topic that deserves further investigation. So thank you, Dr. Pemberton. The Nation Publishing, as a supporting sponsor for over 30 years. Our head of Department of History and Philosophy, Dr. Rodney Worrell. UWITV for streaming services, campus security, the department's administrative staff, especially Ms. Shelley Brathwaite and Toyka Carter, the Mount Restaurant, the ushers, Dr. Donna Green Rusnaihi, the cultural, and she's with the Cultural Policy Research Section of the Prime Minister's Office, and they're responsible for sponsoring the streaming tonight. The Campus Lecture Series Fund, the Department of Marketing and Communications, and you, the in-person and online audiences. Thank you. Finally, let me remind you of the upcoming Elsa Gavaya book launch on October 21st at 7 p.m. in the 3Ws Pavilion. We do hope to see you there.
Thank you very much, Andre. And with that, Dr. Worrell, we remain here. So you would join us for some refreshments on the far right, where we could continue the conversation about who eats dogs and cats. Thank you very much.